afternoon, everyone. This is Allison from Fanshawe Pioneer Village. This afternoon, we will be reading Chapter 5 of The Boy with an R in His Hand by James Reaney. Chapter 5 is entitled Croaker. Don't know what that's about. We'll find out. Chapter 5, Croaker. Early one October afternoon, the sky was gray as an old board with the sun in it like a dim yellow knothole. A short, red-haired man came inquiring after Alec at the McAllisters' home. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the frost had come early. "You're somewhat older than I thought," said Mr. Mackenzie. "Are you the orphan boy Mr. McAllister said I might have as my apprentice?" "No, sir, I'm Joel Buchanan. It's my brother Alec you want. He's up at my uncle's mill on the river." "I must go and get him then, mustn't I?" "Yes, poor Alec. He doesn't seem to get along with any of his masters." "I liked his handwriting and the way he wrote. I may be the master he will get along with. How long is it since you've seen your brother?" 2 months. "Would you like to come along with me and we'll bring him back together? Come, lad, step up into the seat beside me." Joel took a hasty look around him, for he did not want Uncle John to see him in Mr. Mackenzie's company. But there seemed to be no one looking out any of the windows, nor did there seem to be anybody about the street. Joel stepped up into Mr. Mackenzie's gig. A gig is like a kind of wagon. Soon Mr. Mackenzie's wheels were singing over the frosty ground. From time to time, as the horse hooves came down on it, the thin ice over the puddles broke and tinkled. They passed the toll gate, rattled over the bridge, and then turned north on a road that went through a dense forest, sometimes close to the riverbank and other times swerving away from it. Joel felt uneasy under some of Mr. Mackenzie's clear, penetrating looks. He should have tried to see Alec long ago, but then his uncle had made such a pet of him and found Alec such a burden that it was hard to be a bother and a nephew all at the same time. And then, too, Joel was afraid to walk in the forest all alone. He could never have made it to the mill up this dark road. Here's a picture of Mr. Mackenzie and Joel riding in the gig. Joel did not look back into Mr. Mackenzie's eyes, but he did occasionally look at him, long enough to ascertain that Mr. Mackenzie's red hair was in reality a rather old red wig. They ducked down to avoid a low-hanging branch of a great buttonwood tree, so huge that the road had been made to go around it. That same afternoon, Alec sat in the kitchen of the miller's house, polishing a silver buckle he had acquired in a swap with another boy, when he had still been living at home in town. Any real use the buckle might be put to had never occurred to him until that morning, when the miller's wife happened to mention that her pet crow had once run away on them, or rather flown away, and only by the sheerest chance had been caught again in the nearby woods. This had made Alec wonder if the crow had escaped the miller and his wife at a time when people would be spring cleaning in the town, polishing silver spoons that would glint in the sunlight to a pair of greedy eyes at the top of a tree. "Millie, dear," croaked a voice from high up in the chimney corner, "shall I come in to breakfast now?" Hopping back and forth in a willow cage, sometimes sticking his large beak and head out through the width. Oh, I got a tickle in my throat. That's better. Withs was a tame crow that had been taught to talk, as tame crows sometimes can. What this crow said was mostly the overheard conversations of the miller and his wife, although Alec always wondered if the crow had not thought up some of his speeches by himself. For example, "Grind the barley, Charlie," or "Oh, bless my poor old bones." Sometimes he would talk the way Mr. Jakes did. Mr. Jakes was Uncle John's man, who stayed at the mill and watched that the miller and his wife ran it properly, for they were in debt to Uncle John and had to run the mill for him in order to pay off their debt. When Mr. Jakes was in the crow's mind, the latter was apt to say things like, "Get a move on there," or "Get a move on," or "Look lively or I'll thump you one." Alec had been teaching the crow to say, Alec doesn't like it at Uncle John's mill. But so far, the bird had not responded. Alec, after shining the buckle to a high state of polish, placed it on the table and then propped open the kitchen door. Next, he opened the cage and stood by, waiting to see what would happen. He could hear the fire crackling on the hearth and hear the water gurgling through the mill race. The crow, after a long inspection of the unfastened opening, hopped out of the cage and flew rather clumsily over to the table. Alec had tied a long piece of red yarn to the buckle, and this seemed to amuse the bird for some time. However, he overcame his suspicions of the yarn, picked up the buckle in his beak, and flapped out the doorway and down the steps. Since the crow's wings had been clipped after his escape, Alec found it fairly easy to follow him. But he sometimes had to run and also to be very quick at spotting the yarn as the bird led him into the forest away from the mill. Deeper in the forest, the pet crow, or Croaker, as he was known to Alec, managed to shake off his follower, and Alec, humming to himself, seemed to forget his original purpose. Instead, he now fell to picking up the butternuts and beechnuts that were lately fallen to the ground and were now almost covered over with fallen leaves. After he had picked his pockets full of nuts, he lay down in the deep carpet of fallen leaves and read from a pocket Bible his mother had given him long ago for his birthday. In the tiny print, his sharp eyes skimmed over the story of Jacob and Esau. He wondered if he and Joel would ever be like that. How mean it was of Jacob to get everything away from his brother. After a while, Alec put his Bible and knelt in the leaves with his arms on a boulder. He prayed as follows. Dear God, please let me leave here soon. I'm afraid of Mr. Jakes. I don't want to run away again. I don't like being alone at the mill when they're away and only Mr. Jakes is around. Please make Joel love me again and not be so mad at me. Please let me find Croaker. Is that him rustling about there? Please let him be the bird I suspect he is. And if I climb any trees, please don't let me fall down. But chiefly, let me get away from Mr. Jakes and the mill. Amen. After this, Alec got up and walked along the trees with a new sense of being about to find something. And although he found nothing, neither Croaker nor buckle nor red yarn, he still felt the excitement of something about to happen or be discovered. A blue jay screamed, a squirrel chattered angrily at him from the top of an oak tree, a long, straggly V of wild geese flew over, their harsh and crackling cries thrilling him to the bottom of his heart. How he longed to be back at the Red River, where every fall the geese flew like this following the river south. The sky began to grow darker. The shadowy tree trunks around him appeared to grow larger. He leaned against a dead tree and looked at the sunset through the dark stems of the forest. Far away in the corner of the sky, there was a wonderful chalky pink light, with tons of gray cloud pressing down on it from the north. Alec was just thinking very reluctantly, as he looked at this, that he must get back to the mill, when he saw the thread of red yarn hanging from a branch of a dead tree. Croaker was looking down at him from the splintered crown of the tree, not too far from the ground, since the tree had been broken in two by a storm a long time ago. Alec began to inch his way up, and soon looked Croaker in the eye, and thought he did not look too pleased. With a further squirm or two, Alec was able to look down into the dead tree. The inside of the tree was hollow and contained a large and frowsy nest made of twigs and reeds. At the bottom of the nest, there stuck out something bright, the silver buckle with Croaker, which Croaker had just been hiding there. Here is a picture of Croaker in his nest in the dead tree. Alec searched with his hands through the weaving of the nest until he felt another rather smooth object, a silver pin, silver no longer from the rain and snow of a year that had tarnished the metal. Alec lifted it out of the nest and dropped it to the ground. Then he slid down pretty quickly, but not fast enough to beat Croaker, who flew down and pecked away at the nest beside him. "Alec," came his brother's voice, echoing though through the still leafless trees. Alec could see two figures coming up the path, one of them carrying a lantern. At last, Uncle John had come for him, and Joel had come with him. Carrying the nest with and holding on to Croaker, he ran towards the light. "Joel! Uncle John!" "Oh, I'm not your Uncle John," laughed Mackenzie. Yes, he was much shorter than Uncle John was, and with a red wig on his head. "Mr. Mackenzie and I drove here to bring you back, Alec," said his brother. "Mr. Mackenzie wants you to be an apprentice in his print shop." "Oh, I'm so glad," said Alec, "for I don't think they need me at the mill any longer. Mr. Jakes keeps saying he's going to tie me to the mill wheel, and I think he means it." "Well, I'll not let him do that," said Mackenzie. "What have you got there, lad?" "It's a crow's nest," said Alec. "This is Mrs. Chapel's pet crow, Croaker. Look what I found in the nest." Alec held up the silver brooch, and Croaker introduced himself by asking Charlie to grind the barley. "What is the story behind this pin, lad?" asked Mr. Mackenzie. "Why, you see, I think it's Mrs. Strachan's pin, as was stolen from her a year or two ago, and I think that if you were to go through the nest, you'd find her silver spoon." Mr. Mackenzie held up the lantern to see better. Their shadows, huge and tall, wavered against the tree trunks along the path. On the way back to the mill, the boys told Mr. Mackenzie about Rebecca and her story of how the spoon was really stolen. At the mill, Alec said goodbye to the miller and his wife, who had been loudly wondering where he and Croaker had got to. They had returned from a visit to find Croaker and the boy gone, as well as a fire out and the kitchen door wide open. Alec scarcely had time to calm them down. Finally, as Alec was climbing into the gig beside Mr. Mackenzie and Joel, he heard a horse galloping up the road from the town. "Where you taking that boy?" said Mr. Jakes, dismounting from his horse. He was a hulking brute of a man, with shaggy black hair that still didn't quite cover the fact that Mr. Jakes had, at some time or another, lost both of his ears. "That boy's to stay here." "I'm not apprenticed to you," said Alec. "This boy's my boy," said Mr. Mackenzie, dryly, and shook the reins to get his horse going. "Mr. McAllister told me to come up and get him. I see no reason why any child should be left in your care, Mr. Jakes, and I bid you a good evening." Here's a picture of Alec, Joel, and Mr. Mackenzie holding the nest there where Croaker had hidden all of his goodies. Jakes roared out at this and padded along behind them for a few minutes, but at length gave up the chase. Alec wondered if Mr. Jakes would now pursue them on his horse, and when they came to the buttonwood tree he had a nervous dread that he saw the man lying up in the tree, waiting to tumble down as they passed under the low-hanging branch. But nothing like this happened. Instead, Mr. Mackenzie had them tell their story, how they had been orphaned in the Red River country and came down through the wilderness to Upper Canada. Mr. Mackenzie told how he too had lost his father early in life, in Scotland, and had been brought up by his loving mother, who had sacrificed a great many things that her son might be educated. Alec asked him what Scotland was like, and Mr. Mackenzie told them of old, crowded cities and blue, distant hills, a land where there was not been a large forest for centuries, and wolves were no more to be seen, where there was an old wall the Romans had built that marched over the hill from sea to sea, had built long before this new country had ever been dreamt of. As they crossed over the bridge, the horses' hooves made a hollow sound that meant safety to Alec, but also the end of the talk. These two things were even more true after Mr. Mackenzie had paid the toll gate keeper, and the toll gate was shut behind them. In the darkness now, the town of York was just a handful of sparks where people had lamps and candles lit at windows. As they came up to Uncle John's door, an owl cried a shivery cry. "It's tomorrow morning I'll see you, mind," said Mackenzie, imparting to Alec, "at 8 o'clock sharp." Alec promised to be there. The two boys watched the lantern on Mr. Mackenzie's gig move away, grow smaller, and then disappear on the other side of the thick-branched willow tree. When they turned toward the house, the elegant window seemed to Alec to frown at them. "Where have you been?" said the study window on the left. "And who have you been with?" asked the drawing room window on the right. And that is the end of chapter 5. Tomorrow we will be doing, I believe, a section of our other book, and then we have a story from At the Village. Next week we will be going down to 1 video a day for the rest of some of this book, as well as the remainder of our other book and some of our other activities. And then going forward, we have a little something different planned. So we're looking forward to telling you all about that next week, and we hope you have a lovely evening, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a great day.